It was summer of 1994 in a college town in Michigan when a student returned home to her apartment with a friend after a night out. After parking her car, a person emerged from the darkness, walked up to her car, and shot her. She managed to drive a short distance before losing consciousness at the wheel. And tragically, she wouldn't survive her injuries. Her passenger immediately identified a teen standing in the crowd as the gunman, and he was arrested. But the charges didn't stick, and to this day, nobody has ever gone to trial for her murder, and those close to her have been left without any answers. In this episode, I not only break down the details of this tragic case, I also discuss the controversial topic of eyewitness misidentifications. My name is Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing you the unsolved murder of Renee Welka. Just outside of Ann Arbor, Michigan, lies the college town of Ypsilanti. Home to Eastern Michigan University, EMU is a smaller state school located between Detroit and Ann Arbor. The university is known for being one of the most diverse in makeup and has a range of degree offerings from arts to business to education, human services, and technology. Also, from what I read, it's pretty commonly a commuter school. That was the case for one of the school's juniors in 1994. 22-year-old Renee Welka. Renee was majoring in business and marketing, and she lived off campus at the Glencoe Hills apartment complex. Born January 16, 1972 to Nancy and Thomas Welka, Renee also had an older brother, Jay, and was known for being kind and a hard worker. She was a proud member of the Sigma 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 sorority, and she loved to shop and water ski. And in addition to going to school, she worked evenings waitressing at a place called Mountain Jack's in Ann Arbor to pay her way through college. In fact, that's what she had been doing on the evening of July 29, 1994. After finishing up her shift, Renee went home for a couple of hours before going back out again with a friend of hers. I'll be upfront, one of the most infuriating things about this case is the lack of information that has been released to the public, even 30 years later. I'll get into more of that a little later. I understand not releasing pieces that are relevant to the crime scene and immediate investigation that may help you, say, weed out suspects, but I mean, even the smallest of details, police are just, mum's the word. So Renee and her friend go out for the evening and seemingly have a normal night. They get back to the parking lot of Renee's apartment complex and park the car. I have a few Google Maps photos of the different buildings and parking lots of this complex. It's a pretty big one, and some of the buildings are set up in a way where there's parking spots that pull right up to the curb outside of the doors to the building. They look like they have more of an assigned parking setup. And then there are other buildings that have a bigger parking lot style. And based on what I could read about the crime, it seems like Renee had lived in one of these types of buildings that had the bigger lots. So she pulls up in her white Ford Escort and she parks. It's a little before 2 a.m. And there's slightly different accounts in the source material, but the majority of them state that she turned off the car and it was one of those situations where her and her friend were sitting there and chatting for a minute before they got out. PSA, if you listen to my podcast regularly, I think it goes without saying that I do not victim blame on here, but if you're new, now you know. So to be clear, what I'm about to do is not that, but what I will do is speak to situations and discuss personal safety when it makes sense. And this goes out to men and women out there because I actually think this is something we are less safe with today. When you park your car at the store, at the doctor's office, at your home, do not sit there and chit-chat. Do not fiddle around with things. Do not sit and doom scroll on your phone. Get inside. It can wait. Criminals look for opportunities for people to be distracted and capitalize for many types of crimes. Robberies, carjackings, abductions, assaults, you name it. Now, in this case, it doesn't sound like they were there for very long. And then suddenly, someone just appears on the driver's side. The person is brandishing a gun, and Renee quickly tries to start the vehicle, and as she's leaning forward a bit to jiggle her keys into the ignition, the person fires a shot through the window at close range. Renee's car starts at the exact same time, and she puts her foot on the accelerator. Renee makes it approximately 300 yards, but never gets out of the parking lot. I just want to take a moment to imagine how insanely scary this was for her passenger. In an instant, you are just talking with your friend and hanging out, and suddenly someone's there with a gun, your friend is shot, and now she's driving the vehicle, injured, slumped over the steering wheel, and you're the passenger. How horrifically traumatizing. As the car comes to a stop, Renee's passenger gets out of the car and is understandably panicked. Onlookers start to gather and 911 is called. EMS promptly responds and rushes the gravely injured Renee Welka to St. Joseph Mercy Hospital. Doctors did everything they could to save the beautiful young woman's promising life, but her injuries were just too severe. At 3:10 a.m. on July 30th, 1994, Renee Welka was pronounced dead. I want to take a moment to thank you for listening to this week's episode. Growing the podcast will help me to reach more people in sharing these cold cases. Please follow me on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Interacting with and sharing my posts about the episodes helps spread the word. So thank you, and now back to the show. The surrounding community was shaken up, understandably, and all the commotion drew a crowd. You have sounds of a gunshot, screaming, a car coming to an abrupt stop, and even though Renee was whisked away in an ambulance fairly quickly, there was still a huge presence in the parking lot. Neighbors had come out to see if they could help and just to see what was going on. Among those was an 18-year-old man named Clarence Powell II. I say man, but Clarence had really just recently graduated high school, and he was the neighbor of Renee. And when I say neighbor, I just mean that they both lived close to each other at Glencoe Hills, so they weren't like next door neighbors. Clarence claimed he had come outside, just like everyone else, to see what was up. In fact, he was even barefoot. But Renee's passenger was talking to police, and suddenly she told police, "Hey, that's him. That's the man who shot Renee." So without incident, Clarence Powell II was taken into police custody. Now, a few important talking points here. Clarence was allegedly the only black man in the crowd that had formed. At that time, there were no other eyewitnesses who saw anything. It was just the passenger. And, of course, there is some speculation about how much she really could have seen, being on the other side of the car, it happening so quickly, and it being dark out. At this point, police were barely into their investigation. It's not like they had gotten to that point where they were going door to door and asking. They just took the ID and brought him in. On August 1st, 1994, Clarence Thomas II was arraigned in 14A District Court and charged with 1 count of open murder and 1 count of committing a felony while in possession of a firearm. Judge Betty Widgeon set a preliminary investigation hearing for August 11th and denied bond for Powell. This caused an uproar. Clarence Thomas was a kid who just graduated high school and was set to be a star college athlete. He had no criminal history, and everyone who knew him said he absolutely would never do anything like this, that he was a gentle spirit. In his senior year of high school, he had been the captain of the Huron basketball team. He had been part of a college club, a Boy Scout, and a member of the Explorers for Engineering and Law students. He had also been the recipient of the Martin Luther King Jr. Spirit Award, which went to a student who wanted to earn a degree in business administration. Clarence maintained his innocence and stated that he had just come outside to check out what was happening, but police were having none of it. They tested his hands for gunshot residue. Police were also on the hunt for a murder weapon. They knew Renee had been shot with a small caliber handgun, and thus far none had been found on Clarence or nearby anywhere. As August 11th approached, those closest to Clarence organized. On August 6, 1994, a rally was held. It was there his father spoke out. He said, quote, "A parent knows his children. Clarence is my only son, my only child," end quote. Around 75 supporters arrived at Huron High School that night. The NAACP president of Ann Arbor, Jim Williams, stated, quote, "He was the only black male in the parking lot. He went out to see what the commotion was and ended up being accused as the perpetrator." If this is a bad identification, any black male in the community is vulnerable to being accused like this. It's sad. We invest so much time and effort in our children to get them to do the right thing, and then this happens. And the real tragedy in this is that if they grabbed the wrong person, it means the person who committed this crime is going around free. When a situation like this occurs, it damages the whole society and lets the true perpetrator get away. End quote. On August 11th, 1994, the preliminary examination was held. It lasted less than 5 minutes. The charges against Clarence Powell II were dropped without prejudice. What this means is that if prosecutors build a case in the future, they are able to try him again. They can refile the same charges, alter the claim, or bring the case to another court. Clarence Powell's attorney said that Clarence was inside his apartment eating grapes and watching TV. A friend had come forward saying they were on the phone with Clarence during the time of the attack. Half of the room erupted in relief and the other in profound grief. As someone who doesn't have all the answers to the case, I feel sadness for both sides. If Clarence Powell did not commit this crime, what a difficult thing he endured as an 18-year-old. Operating off the assumption that the gunman was black based off of the ID that the witness had made, he was identified wrongly then in that case just simply because he was the only black person in the crowd. He spent days in jail and his whole future was on the line, and I feel for him for that. I also have immense sympathy for the family of Renee Welka and her passenger. Look, I have no doubt Renee Welka's passenger was not heading out on that evening of July 29th and anticipating her friend being murdered, and then using that moment to pin a crime on an innocent kid. I don't feel she was trying to misidentify him, if that's what actually happened. In the end, no matter what, the circumstances remained that Renee Welka's murderer was walking free. Clarence Powell went off to college a few weeks later and shared the following statement in a local paper. "First of all, I want to thank God, my protector and my friend. Without him, I know I would not be a free man today. For myself, my family, my friends, and supporters, we all send our condolences to the Welka family. We know that you have had a great loss. I am sure that the real killer will pay for this senseless act of violence. I would also just like to say to the Welka family, just hang in there. Everything happens for a reason, and none of us are in a position to question God. Remember that if the person is never caught, he will eventually have to answer to God. I want to thank everyone who believed in me and supported me from the moment they heard the news about my situation. You really find out who your friends are in times like these. Although I can't say any names, I love you all and thanks again. This goes out to all the people who are inside the county jail, my friends who came to the court, and people who sent their support from wherever they were. To my family, thanks for being there for me, especially Mom and Dad. You did everything you could and more to get me out of there. All I can say is, I love you and thanks. Good things come to those who are good to others. No more tears, no more tears." The Welkas were not as convinced of Powell's innocence. Nancy told a local newspaper that chemical testing of Clarence Powell's hands had revealed traces of the same ingredients found in gunpowder. The police officers have never commented on this one way or another, other than to say early on that they were conducting this testing. The Pittsfield Township Police Department still openly named Clarence Powell as their main suspect and said that the eyewitness statement had provided invaluable information. But after that, The investigation stalled and has for all of these years. If you try to find information on Renee's case, you'll stumble across about 5 articles in newspaper archives. There was a task force for all cold cases in Michigan formed in the early 2000s, and Renee's case was briefly mentioned, but it's just been stuck. So with that, let's talk about some of the unanswered questions in her case. First, there's motive. Police initially suspected this was an attempted carjacking, and this is how it was mostly reported on. But something about that just doesn't make sense to me. Something I wish we knew is, was there any conversation between the gunman before he started shooting? That's the only way I'd consider this an attempted carjacking based on how this crime played out. Otherwise, it doesn't really make that much sense. If you want to steal a car, you try to get the person out of the car so you can take it. This supposedly happened really quickly. The gunman just approached and shot as Renee was trying to get away. What I do wonder, and what hasn't been reported on all that much, was could there have been a case of mistaken identity? Was that bullet meant for someone else? I was reading a little bit about the area, and I have to just sort of take the word of people who have lived there, and in reading reviews and comments, it seems like it's a fairly safe place to live, but there is some crime that people have experienced there, and the complex is a bit run down. If there was, say, a drug dispute or something like that, Renee was driving a pretty commonly found car at the time. There were probably dozens of tenants with the same type of car. So while there's nothing to say it was a mistaken identity, I don't think it can be eliminated either. And to me personally, it makes more sense than a carjacking. This seemed like the person was there to shoot, not steal a car. Next is the fixation on Clarence Powell II. There isn't anything out there about looking into other suspects outside of him. Of course they could be, and I'm sure they have to some extent, but how much? We don't really know. It just seemed like in the limited interviews they did, they just felt like Clarence Thomas did this crime and they couldn't prove it. One source did share that Renee had an on-again, off-again boyfriend who we'll call Matt, and Matt worked with her at Mountain Jack's, and friends and colleagues reported that they argued a lot. Was he looked into strongly? Did he know after she left her shift that night that she was going out to bars, and did he get jealous? The only thing about that is that if it were someone that Renee knew, I would think her friend would have been able to identify this person, and she didn't. Even though this area hardly ever had homicides, another woman had been murdered in her apartment in nearby Strawberry Hill just 3 months prior in an apparent robbery. Could those be connected? It's a stretch. One was a break-in in an apartment, and one was a parking lot shooting. But homicides were so rare in this area, you really don't know. Another consideration is that this was just a random shooting from a violent person. Those crimes do happen, and they're very hard to solve. And of course, there's always the possibility that Renee's passenger's identification was correct. In considering that, it's important to take a look into eyewitness identification. According to the Innocence Project, eyewitness misidentification is the single greatest cause of wrongful conviction in the United States. Not only that, but eyewitness misidentification is more likely to happen when the perpetrator and witness have different racial backgrounds. A review of 218 wrongful convictions that were overturned by DNA evidence found that 1/3 of the wrongful convictions were caused by cross-racial misidentification. In Renee's case, her friend was presumably white based on a lot of the racial speculation about the girl picking out the one black man in the crowd. And of course, Clarence Powell II was black. A 2014 study on eyewitness error looked into some of the causes of error when it comes to eyewitness statements. First, things that occur immediately after the crime can impact the memory. Information supplied by friends, police, the media, it can all influence perceived memory, and not just of the perpetrator, but details of the crime itself. For example, if police ask, did the attacker have brown hair? This could influence the memory, and the witness doesn't even know that the change has occurred. and it can be difficult, if not impossible, to retrieve their original organic memories. Also, witnesses tend to second-guess themselves. If police repeatedly question the witness, this can shake their confidence. The flip side can also be damaging. For example, praising a witness for IDing someone or telling them, "Oh yeah, another witness pointed them out too." A lot of work has been done on police protocol over the years to combat this, and 1994 was better than, say, 1964, but still not as good as 2025. And even still, this does happen in present day. We'd be kidding ourselves to think otherwise. A lot of the reform done involves police retraining. Conducting proper eyewitness interviews and identification procedures is paramount to the integrity of the investigation. In fact, in 2003, a guide was published by the National Institute of Justice titled Eyewitness Evidence, a Training Manual for Law Enforcement, which was smart because a survey conducted across the US and Canada on law enforcement officers found that they had limited training in this area. Someone who has been a proponent of this work is an unlikely friendship duo. In July of 1984, an assailant broke into Jennifer Thompson Canino's apartment and sexually assaulted her at knife point. She studied the attacker's face and got a great look at him and memorized his features. Jennifer remembered her attacker as a black male and worked with composite sketch artists to capture his unique features. She was then shown a flawed photo lineup and picked out a man named Ronald Cotton. Ronald insisted he was innocent, but her testimony at trial heavily influenced the jury, and he was sentenced to life in prison. 10 years later, DNA evidence would exonerate Ronald Cotton and lead authorities to a man already in prison who had confessed to the crime to an inmate. 2 years later, Ronald and Jennifer agreed to meet, and in an incredible story of forgiveness, the two took their tragedy and translated it into action. They wrote a book and began advocating for changes in procedures to prevent this from happening in the future. If you're interested, I'll link the book in the show notes. The thing about Renee's case, though, is that from everything we've been told, her friend simply picked him out of the crowd and said, "That's the man." In some regards, she really should have been whisked away and cared for and not put in a position to try to identify someone. At the same time, police have been given a lot of flack for their response, but I don't think it's fair to blame them for taking him in at the scene. If you have a shooting and the immediate witness is saying, "Yes, the man is standing right there," can you imagine if the police had not taken him in for questioning at that point? But that is the important caveat here. They should have just brought him in for questioning. The immediate charges and the lack of evidence to have those charges, that does merit the scrutiny, in my opinion. I, of course, do not have all the evidence in front of me that police do, so I'm trying not to play Monday morning quarterback here. But it couldn't have been too much evidence or the case wouldn't have been dismissed in 5 minutes. This case is a tragedy all around. If Clarence Powell II is innocent, he has carried a cloud over him his whole life where people still view him as the prime suspect. Only Clarence Powell knows for sure about his innocence. If he is innocent, then her friend not only has to live with the grief of witnessing the murder of her friend, but also sit with the constant questioning of what she saw that night. Honestly, until someone is arrested, she has to live with that in her life, period. And then there's the family of Renee Welka. They have had to live their lives without their beautiful daughter and sister, never having answers. In a 2009 article with the Ann Arbor News, Nancy Welka shared her grief. She said, quote, "She would have been the most fantastic mother because of her way with kids. They all loved her. They'd gravitate toward her. She'd light up a room when she entered. Nothing will bring her back, but I just want to know why. So many promises for her future, and for it to be snuffed out, how could somebody take another person's life?" End quote. Her father, Thomas, added in, quote, "You always think the police are going to find the answer in a couple of days, and it doesn't happen." End quote. Nancy Welka said that losing Renee robbed her family of everything. Thomas Welka died in 2013 at age 72 of dementia. Nancy is still waiting for answers in her daughter's case. She has struggled with her mental health in the years following her death, and even went on the TLC show Hoarding Buried Alive, sharing how losing her daughter has impacted her. Much of Renee's bedroom is how she left it. Jay was also on the show, and talking about his sister was so raw for him all these years later. My heart just broke. You could feel the weight of his pain through the screen. Nancy's too. And if you can watch that episode and not cry, you get a medal. I felt absolutely devastated for this family. This case is going to be one of the more difficult ones to solve. There isn't DNA evidence, the gun was never found, and all there was a shaky eyewitness statement. In this case, you hope that the perpetrator confided in someone, and that the person finds it in their heart to come forward, or that the killer unburdens himself of this secret. I imagine living with murdering a young woman is a heavy burden to carry. It's not too late to come forward. Nancy Welka has said in multiple interviews that catching the killer would not heal the pain of not getting Renee back, but it would help her to feel some resolution. Nancy is getting older, and the time to bring her peace and answers is now. If you have any information on the murder of Renee Welka, please contact the Pittsfield Township Police Department on their confidential tip line at 734-822-4958. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please leave a 5-star review and subscribe to the podcast on your preferred listening platform. Word of mouth has been vital in helping me grow this podcast to reach more listeners and share these unsolved cases. If you have a case suggestion, please contact simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. And as always, thank you so much for listening.